Picture this scene and let every detail burn into your memory, because what I am about to tell you is one of the most insane stories of aerial combat in human history, and it sounds so impossible that if someone put it in a movie you would walk out of the theater saying that is ridiculous, that could never happen, but it did happen, and every word of it is documented in military records. It is December 7, 1941, and you are a young American pilot stationed in Hawaii having the most peaceful Sunday morning of your life. You probably stayed out late the night before, because that is what young pilots do when they are stationed in paradise. You are thinking about breakfast and maybe hitting the beach later, and the war in Europe seems like something happening on another planet, and then the entire world explodes around you. Japanese bombs are falling from the sky, planes with the red rising sun are strafing everything that moves, ships are burning in Pearl Harbor, and the United States of America has just been attacked in the most devastating surprise assault in its history. Now here is where a normal person would run for a shelter and hide, because the sky is literally filled with enemy aircraft and every American plane on the ground is being systematically destroyed. But you are not a normal person, you are a fighter pilot, and somewhere in your adrenaline-soaked brain a crazy idea forms. You are going to get in your plane and fight back. Not tomorrow when reinforcements arrive. Not in an hour when things calm down. Right now, while bombs are still falling and Japanese fighters own the sky. And oh, by the way, there are only 2 of you willing to try this suicide mission against an enemy force of over 60 aircraft. And your commanding officers think you are absolutely insane, but they let you go anyway, because what else is there to lose at this point? This is the story of 2 American pilots who flew into the mouth of hell itself and somehow not only survived but became the first American heroes of World War II. The morning of December 7, 1941 started like any other Sunday at Wheeler Field and Halewa Airstrip in Hawaii, and the pilots stationed there had absolutely no idea that their lives were about to change forever. The night before had been a typical Saturday night for young military men stationed in what was essentially a tropical paradise. There had been parties and dancing and probably a bit too much drinking, and when the sun came up on Sunday morning most of the pilots were sleeping in or nursing hangovers. The idea that Japan would attack the United States seemed absurd to most Americans at the time, because the 2 countries were still technically at peace and the diplomatic negotiations were ongoing. Yes, there was tension, and yes, everyone knew that war was possible someday, but the idea that it would start with a massive surprise attack on American soil was simply not in anyone's mental framework. This is why when the first bombs started falling, many people initially thought it was some kind of training exercise gone wrong, or maybe an accident at the ammunition depot. The human brain has a hard time accepting the unthinkable even when it is happening right in front of your eyes, and this cognitive delay cost precious minutes and lives as the Japanese attack unfolded with devastating precision. The 2 pilots at the center of our story were Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, and these 2 young men were about to do something that would define the rest of their lives and earn them a permanent place in American military history. Welch was 23 years old and Taylor was also in his early 20s. They were both fighter pilots assigned to the 47th Pursuit Squadron, and they had become friends in the way that young men in the military often do, through shared training and shared boredom and the particular bond that forms between people who fly dangerous machines for a living. Neither of them could have imagined when they woke up that morning that by the end of the day they would be credited with shooting down multiple enemy aircraft in the first American aerial victories of the war, or that their actions would become the subject of intense debate and investigation and eventually recognition as genuine acts of heroism. The attack began at 7:48 in the morning when the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor and the surrounding military installations. The Japanese had launched 353 aircraft from 6 aircraft carriers that had secretly approached within striking distance of Hawaii. The attacking force included fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes, and they came in waves designed to maximize destruction and minimize American response. The primary targets were the battleships moored at Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese also targeted airfields to prevent American aircraft from getting into the air and fighting back. This was tactically brilliant because if you can destroy your enemy's planes on the ground, you do not have to fight them in the air, and the Japanese executed this part of the plan with terrifying efficiency. Rows of American aircraft were caught sitting in neat lines on the runways and parking areas. They had been arranged that way to make them easier to guard against sabotage, but this arrangement also made them perfect targets for strafing and bombing runs. Aircraft after aircraft exploded or caught fire as Japanese pilots methodically worked their way across the American airfields. When the attack began, Welch and Taylor were not at their duty station, but at a private beach house where officers sometimes gathered for social events. They had been at a party the night before and were still there when they heard the sounds of explosions in the distance. At first, like many others, they thought it might be Navy exercises or some kind of accident, but the explosions kept coming and kept getting closer, and then someone turned on a radio and heard the frantic announcements that Pearl Harbor was under attack. This was not a drill, this was not an exercise, this was war, and in that moment both young pilots made a decision that would change their lives. Instead of seeking shelter like sensible people would do, they decided to get to their aircraft and fight. The only problem was that their aircraft were at Haleywa Airstrip, which was a small auxiliary field several miles away. Their main base at Wheeler Field was already under heavy attack and the planes there were being destroyed, but Haleywa was a smaller, less important target and the Japanese might not have hit it yet. It was a slim hope, but it was the only hope they had. The two pilots jumped into a car and began racing toward Haleywa Airstrip at speeds that were probably not safe under any circumstances, let alone during an enemy attack. The roads were chaos with people fleeing in all directions and smoke rising from multiple locations across the island. Overhead, Japanese aircraft were still arriving in waves, and the sound of their engines mixed with the explosions and the anti-aircraft fire that was finally beginning to respond to the attack. The sky above Hawaii was filled with Japanese aircraft, and two American fighters were about to climb into that hornet's nest with nothing but their training and their courage to protect them. The P-40 Warhawk was a decent fighter for its time, but it was not the equal of the Japanese Zero in many respects. The Zero was lighter and more maneuverable and could outclimb the P-40 in most situations. What the P-40 had going for it was heavier armament, better dive speed, and armor protection that the Zero lacked. A good pilot could use these advantages, but first he had to survive long enough to use them, and against odds of 30 to 1 the chances of survival seemed slim. But Welch and Taylor were not thinking about odds or survival. They were thinking about the bombs falling on their friends and their country and the urgent need to do something about it. The first engagement came almost immediately after they gained altitude and began looking for targets. The sky was so full of Japanese aircraft that finding them was not the problem. The problem was choosing which ones to attack first and trying not to get killed by the dozens of others. Welch and Taylor made a quick decision to go after a formation of Japanese bombers that was heading toward one of the installations. Bombers were larger targets and less maneuverable than fighters, and shooting down bombers would directly reduce the amount of damage being done to American facilities and personnel. They dove on the formation with their guns blazing, and the effect was immediate and dramatic. Japanese aircraft that had been operating with impunity suddenly found themselves under attack, and the neat formations began to scatter. Welch claimed his first kill within minutes of engaging, sending a Japanese aircraft spinning toward the ground in flames. Taylor scored his own kills as well. And suddenly these two American pilots were not just surviving but actually winning. The Japanese pilots must have been completely shocked to encounter American fighters in the air, because the whole point of attacking the airfields first was to prevent exactly this situation. They had been told that American air power would be destroyed on the ground and that they would have complete freedom to operate over Hawaii. But here were two American fighters tearing into their formations and shooting down aircraft. The psychological effect of this unexpected resistance was significant, because it meant that the operation was not going perfectly according to plan, and when things do not go according to plan in combat, the advantage shifts toward the defenders. The Japanese pilots now had to watch for American fighters while also completing their attack missions, and this divided attention reduced their effectiveness. Of course, 2 fighters against 60-plus aircraft was still ridiculous odds, and the Japanese could have swarmed and destroyed both Americans at any time. But air combat is chaotic and confusing, and the Japanese pilots did not immediately coordinate an effective response to this tiny but aggressive American force. Welch and Taylor fought through the first wave of the attack and then had to land to refuel and rearm because their ammunition was running low and their fuel tanks were not endless. This was one of the most dangerous moments of the entire engagement, because landing meant being vulnerable on the ground, and the Japanese were specifically targeting aircraft on the ground, but they had no choice. You cannot fight without ammunition and you cannot fly without fuel. They landed at Wheeler Field this time, which was their home base and which had been heavily damaged in the initial attack. The ground was littered with destroyed aircraft and burning debris, and the infrastructure was in chaos. But the ground crews were still working, still doing their jobs despite the bombs and the strafing, and they immediately began refueling and rearming the 2 P-40s so the pilots could get back into the fight. This was heroism of a different kind. The unglamorous heroism of doing your job under fire so that others can do theirs. The second sortie was even more intense than the first, because by now the second wave of Japanese aircraft was arriving and the attack was reaching its peak of violence. Welch and Taylor took off again into a sky that was even more crowded with enemy aircraft than before, and they went right back to work. attacking bombers and fighters and anything with a red rising sun painted on it. Taylor's aircraft was hit during this phase of the fighting and he was wounded in the arm, but he kept flying and kept fighting because what else was he supposed to do? Welch was in the thick of it as well, maneuvering and shooting and trying to stay alive while taking down as many enemy aircraft as possible. The dogfighting was close and desperate, and at several points both pilots came within seconds of being killed. Bullets tore through their aircraft and left holes in the wings and fuselage, but the P-40s kept flying and the pilots kept fighting, and then something happened that seems almost too perfect to be true but which is documented in multiple accounts of the battle. As Welch was bringing his aircraft in for a final landing after the attack was ending, his engine began to fail. The aircraft had taken so much damage during the fighting that the engine simply could not continue operating. Oil pressure dropped and temperatures spiked and the engine began to seize up. Welch was essentially flying a glider at this point, coaxing every last bit of power out of his dying machine. He lined up with the runway and brought the aircraft down in what had to be a perfect landing because there would be no going around for another attempt. The wheels touched the ground and the aircraft rolled down the runway and came to a stop, and at that exact moment, literally the second the aircraft stopped moving, the engine died completely. It gave one final cough and then went silent. The aircraft had carried its pilot through impossible odds, taken him into combat against overwhelming enemy forces, brought him home safely, and then expired from its wounds the instant its job was done. If you wrote that in a screenplay, people would say it was too dramatic and unrealistic, but that is exactly what happened. The aftermath of December 7th was a time of chaos and confusion and gradually emerging understanding of just how devastating the attack had been. The United States Pacific Fleet had been crippled with 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, and over 2,400 Americans killed. It was the worst military disaster in American history, and it had happened in less than 2 hours. But even in the midst of this catastrophe there were stories of heroism and resistance that gave Americans something to hold on to, and the story of Welch and Taylor was one of the most dramatic. Here were 2 young pilots who had refused to accept the role of victims, who had chosen to fight back when fighting back seemed suicidal, and who had not only survived but had actually inflicted significant damage on the enemy. Between them they were credited with shooting down at least 6 and possibly as many as 8 Japanese aircraft, making them the first American aerial victories of World War II. The recognition for their actions was complicated by the chaotic circumstances of the battle and the difficulty of confirming kills when everything was happening so fast and so violently. Initially both pilots were recommended for the Medal of Honor, which is the highest military decoration in the United States, but the recommendations were eventually downgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross, which is still an extremely prestigious award. The official reason for the downgrade was that the pilots had taken off without orders, which was technically true. They had not received formal authorization to fly that morning because there was no one available to give such authorization and no time to wait for it. Some historians believe that other factors may have been involved in the decision not to award the Medal of Honor, including the general desire of the military establishment to not highlight individual heroism too much when so many others had died in the attack. Whatever the reasons, both pilots received the Distinguished Service Cross and were recognized as heroes even if the highest possible honor was not granted. The story of Welch and Taylor illustrates something important about combat and heroism that often gets lost in the popular imagination. Heroism is not usually planned or calculated. It is not the result of careful analysis of risks and rewards. It is an instinctive response to circumstances that leaves no time for careful consideration. When those bombs started falling, Welch and Taylor did not sit down and calculate their odds of survival or consider whether fighting back was the strategically optimal choice. They just acted. They did what their training and their character compelled them to do, and that instinctive response happened to be extraordinarily brave. This is why military training is so intense and so focused on building automatic responses, because when the real situation comes there is no time to think. You have to act on instinct. And your instincts had better be the right ones. The aircraft they flew that day, the P-40 Warhawk, deserves its own recognition in this story because it was the machine that made their heroism possible. The P-40 was not the best fighter of World War II. It was outperformed by later American designs and by some of its contemporaries from other nations. But it was what was available on December 7, 1941, and it did its job. The aircraft that Welch flew was so damaged by the end of the battle that its engine literally died on landing, but it had carried him through the entire engagement. It had taken hits that would have destroyed lesser machines, and it had kept flying until its pilot was safely on the ground. There is a tendency in military history to focus on the human heroes and forget the machines they operated. but those machines were designed and built by thousands of workers whose efforts made the heroism possible, and the machines themselves became partners in the combat, responding to their pilots' demands until they simply could not respond anymore. The psychological impact of Pearl Harbor on the American public was profound, and the stories of resistance and heroism like that of Welch and Taylor played an important role in shaping the national response. Americans were angry and shocked by the attack, but they were also inspired by the examples of those who had fought back. The attack was intended to demoralize the United States and convince Americans that resistance against Japanese expansion was futile. But it had exactly the opposite effect. Instead of demoralizing Americans, it unified them. Instead of convincing them to accept a negotiated peace, it made them determined to fight until total victory. Admiral Yamamoto, who planned the attack, reportedly understood this. He is often quoted as saying that the attack had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. Whether or not he actually said those exact words, the sentiment was accurate. The United States that emerged from Pearl Harbor was a very different nation than the one that had existed the day before. George Welch went on to have a remarkable career in aviation that extended far beyond his heroism on December 7. During the remainder of World War II, he continued to serve as a fighter pilot and added to his tally of aerial victories. He was credited with 16 confirmed kills by the end of the war, making him an ace several times over. But perhaps even more remarkably, he went on to become a test pilot after the war and was involved in the development of some of the most advanced aircraft in American history. There is credible evidence that he may have actually broken the sound barrier before Chuck Yeager in the famous Bell X-1, although this was never officially recognized because Welch was flying a production aircraft, not an experimental one, and North American Aviation, where he worked as a test pilot, did not want to upstage the official Air Force program. Welch died in 1954 during a test flight when the aircraft he was flying, an F-100 Super Sabre, broke apart during a high-speed dive. He was only 36 years old, but he had packed more into those years than most people do in a much longer lifetime. Kenneth Taylor also continued to serve with distinction after Pearl Harbor. He rose through the ranks and eventually became a brigadier general in the Air Force. He flew combat missions throughout the Pacific Theater and continued to demonstrate the courage and skill that he had shown on December 7. After the war, he transitioned to the Air Force when it was established as a separate branch in 1947 and continued his military career for decades. He retired from active duty in 1971 and lived until 2006, passing away at the age of 86. Throughout his life, he remained connected to the events of December 7 and participated in commemorations and historical events related to Pearl Harbor. He was always humble about his own role, emphasizing that many others had also fought back and that he and Welch were simply the ones who happened to survive and be recognized. The debate about whether Welch and Taylor deserved the Medal of Honor has continued among historians and military enthusiasts ever since the original recommendations were downgraded. There have been periodic efforts to upgrade their awards posthumously and to give them the recognition that many feel they deserve. The argument for the upgrade is straightforward. These two men voluntarily flew into combat against overwhelming odds, shot down multiple enemy aircraft, and helped to salvage some measure of American honor on one of the darkest days in national history. What more could be required for the nation's highest military decoration? The argument against typically focuses on the technical violation of taking off without orders. Although this seems like a remarkably petty objection given the circumstances, commanders who insist on proper authorization when bombs are falling are not commanders who win wars. Whatever the official verdict, history has rendered its own judgment. Welch and Taylor are remembered as heroes. The mechanics and ground crews who made the flights possible also deserve recognition because without their efforts the pilots would have had nothing to fly. When Welch and Taylor arrived at Haleywa airstrip, the aircraft were already being prepared because the ground crews had anticipated that someone would want to fight back. During the brief interval between sorties at Wheeler Field, the ground crews worked under fire to refuel and rearm the aircraft. These were not glamorous tasks, but they were absolutely essential, and the men who performed them showed the same courage as the pilots they supported. In the chaos of that morning, with bombs falling and aircraft burning all around them, they stayed at their posts and did their jobs. This is the kind of quiet heroism that makes military operations possible, and it rarely receives the recognition it deserves. The story of December 7, 1941 is often told as a story of American defeat and failure, and in many ways that is accurate. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a catastrophic intelligence and military failure that cost thousands of lives and crippled American naval power in the Pacific. But within that larger story of failure there are smaller stories of success and heroism that remind us that even in the worst circumstances individuals can make a difference. Welch and Taylor did not save Pearl Harbor. They could not have. Two fighters against the entire Japanese attack force was never going to change the outcome of the day, but what they did do was refuse to be passive victims. They showed that Americans would fight back, and they provided an example that would inspire others in the long war to come. The tactical lessons from their engagement are also worth considering because they illustrate some important principles of air combat. First, they showed that surprise works both ways. The Japanese had achieved complete surprise in the overall attack, but Welch and Taylor achieved their own surprise by appearing in the sky when the Japanese expected no opposition. This unexpected resistance created confusion and forced the Japanese pilots to divert attention from their primary missions. Second, they showed that aggressive action can compensate for numerical inferiority at least temporarily. By attacking immediately and continuously, they prevented the Japanese from organizing an effective response. If they had been passive and defensive, the Japanese would have quickly coordinated and overwhelmed them. Third, they showed the importance of using terrain and circumstances to advantage. They used the chaos of the attack to mask their movements and attack targets of opportunity rather than trying to follow any predetermined plan. The aircraft recognition aspect of the battle is also interesting because in the confusion of that morning it would have been easy to make fatal mistakes. There were American aircraft in the air as well as Japanese, and shooting down friendly aircraft was a constant danger in any air battle. Welch and Taylor had to make split-second identifications of aircraft moving at high speed while also flying their own aircraft and watching for threats. This required the kind of instant recognition skills that only come from intensive training. They had to know the silhouettes and characteristics of Japanese aircraft so well that identification was automatic. Any hesitation in identifying a target could result in either shooting down a friendly aircraft or being shot down by an enemy. The fact that they successfully identified and engaged only enemy aircraft while operating in conditions of maximum chaos is a testament to their training and skill. The fuel and ammunition calculations that Welch and Taylor had to make during the battle illustrate the complex resource management that combat pilots face. You cannot simply fly and fight until you are done because you will run out of fuel or ammunition or both. You have to constantly monitor your resources and make decisions about when to break off and return to base.